Greetings and salutations. I am Mark Twain, and I welcome you to Mark Twain Playhouse. Welcome back. Returning to our story, I'm going to tell you part 2. The celebrated frog legs of Carnivorous County. If you remember correctly, I had, in compliance with the request of a friend of mine, called on old Simon Wheeler and had inquired on behalf of my friend after a Leonidas W. Smiley, only to get a long and tedious tale about some Jim Smiley and a celebrated jumping frog. Then, if your memory is still serving you well, I reported that at that talk's end, I excused myself rather abruptly in order to save myself from the tale of the one-eyed cow. I lied. I had never lied to a reader before, and I have never since. Oh, I have exaggerated the truth a bit, or understated it, but only as a writer's license allows, and with good reason. In this case, however, I told an outright lie. Now, I could try and tell you that it was to save you from further tedium, but I don't want to compound the sin of telling you one lie by telling you another. I lied to save face. I didn't want you to think I was the sort who would stay for more. Truth is, I am. Or at the very least, I was. Anyway, as my memory has haunted me enough, and a week longer, I will attempt to make amends here by giving you a more accurate account of the events of that day. Simon Wheeler began his next story, or should I say, chapter, as suddenly as the last chapter ended, not wishing to allow a captive audience to get away from him. I say chapter, as it was a continuation of the same tale I have elsewhere reported of Jim Smiley and the celebrated jumping frog of Carnivorous County, as told to me in the same earnest monotone by Simon Wheeler. So returning to the story, Simon Wheeler continued. Now it happened that some time later, Jim Smiley sold his celebrated jumping frog to an Ebenezer J. Bass. This year Smiley couldn't make $1 or even a cent off Daniel Webster any longer, as no one would bet on another frog against Daniel. He'd only been beat once, and it wasn't fair and square. And everyone for miles around knew about Daniel. Now, Smiley didn't want to part with his long and trusted and celebrated companion, but this year Bass offered him $500, saying what a fine and healthy frog Daniel was. And times being what they was, Smiley parted with Daniel Webster, and without asking nary a word about this year Mr. Bass's plans with Daniel. He couldn't look old Daniel in the eye either. He knew it was a betrayal. Daniel had made Smiley a living and had been loyal for no more than flies and friendship. And now Smiley was turning his back on Daniel. They said Smiley got rightly drunk that day and that he cried as he was leaving. Now this here Bass fella, he was the owner of a big and fancy restaurant in Stockton, a restaurant where all the rich folk would go. And you can believe it or don't, but at this here restaurant, they served snails and crabs, and you're not going to believe this either, frog legs. They considered it some kind of delicacy or something, and you know how those rich folk love delicacies. Well, you can just call something a delicacy and charge a lot for it, and rich folk will want it. Bass had sought out Daniel Webster on account of him being so famous and all, even in Stockton, where Mr. Bass had his restaurant. And Bass went out and put him on display in his restaurant as a main attraction to steal customers from other restaurants that serve snails and frog legs and whatnot to the rich folk. And as he had advertised, his 1,000th customer was going to be served and perchance get to eat, nay, devour, the legs of Daniel Webster, the celebrated jumping frog of Carnivorous County. Now it was that Smiley moved away from Angel's Camp to Stockton to get himself involved in new and adventurous enterprises. He even up and bought himself an expensive suit and a new pair of shoes. Of course, he found new things to bet on and new people to talk into a bet. One day this year, a new associate of his, a Mr. James Romine, talked him into going to that new fancy restaurant that was owned by Ebenezer Bass, where none other than Daniel Webster was on display. The restaurant was so busy when Smiley and this year Romine fellow arrived, they didn't even notice Daniel was on display. And as they were seated, Ebenezer Bass came out and announced that Smiley was the winner of the contest for the prized frog legs. Mr. Bass didn't recognize Smiley, who was all dressed up like he was. Likewise, Smiley didn't recognize Mr. Bass. And Smiley didn't know that his prize was the legs of his old friend, Daniel Webster. He just knew he had won some prized frog legs. As they were waiting for their dinners, old Smiley started having some reservations about eating anything from a frog. This year Romine then took it upon himself to convince Smiley that frogs were meant to be eaten. Each and every animal on God's earth, said Mr. Romine, as if he were announcing a plain fact, was put here to serve man. Needless to say, there are a few animals we haven't figured out yet, but for the most part, we know what most is for. They can be divided into categories: pets, pests, servants, and food. And they don't cross the line once their category has been decided on. Dogs and cats are pets. We know they wouldn't taste good. In fact, even the thought of eating a cat or a dog makes me sick in my stomach. That's on account of the fact that they are not food, they are pets. Oh, Smiley looked at this year James Romine as if he was back in school and Mr. Romine was his teacher. Now, Mr. Romine went on a-going. Coyotes are pests. They bother our food, our pets, and our servants. They wouldn't make good pets or servants. And can you imagine eating a coyote? Can't say as I can, says Smiley. Now, we all know why cows and pigs and chickens and turkeys were put here. Romine continues. To eat, says Smiley, trying to be a good student. That's right. They's for food. Of course, hens lay eggs for food too. But now you ain't never seen nobody have a cow or a pig for a pet, or shoo one away for being a pest, or use a pig to pull a plow, have you? No, I never, replied Smiley. They're food for the eating. You're learning fast, said Mr. Romine to Smiley, who was looking proud like a prize pupil. They're food indeed. Now, what's oxen for, Smiley? Asked Mr. Romine to the new teacher's pet. Servants, said Smiley, all smiles. Servants. And can there be anything else, Romine asked. Nope, nothing, says Smiley. They ain't pests. They'd make lousy pets. because they ain't going to go fetch. And they sure ain't food. Oxen would taste awful. And how do we know they would taste awful, Smiley? Asked Romine. Why, 'cause they ain't food, says Smiley. They were meant to be our servants. And this they'll stay. Simple, ain't it, says Romine. Yes, sir, Mr. Romine, says Smiley. But, Now, Smiley didn't know whether to ask Mr. Romine this or not, because he didn't want Romine to think he wasn't as smart as he was letting on. But then he remembered that teachers like eager students. So trying to sound like an eager student rather than an ignorant one, he went ahead and asked, well, how do we know which frogs are fur? That's a good question, Smiley. It shows you're thinking. Now we know on God's earth there ain't one animal that has a life of its own. They're all put here for men to eat, put to work, pet, or chase away. Now, can a frog pull a plow? Asked Romine. No, but I had a frog once that was sort of a pet and sort of worked for me, says Smiley. The hell, you say? Then you misused the frog. Of course, you didn't know any better at the time, says Romine. Just then, the waiter brought them their food. The waiter says, and here's your prize, sir, the celebrated frog legs for being the 1,000th customer. Smiley looked down at his dinner. He hardly noticed the mashed potatoes and gravy, the fancy soup, the salad, or the fresh-baked apple dumpling. He just looked at the frog legs in the middle of the dinner plate. Well, what are you waiting for, Mr. Smiley? Dig in, says Romine. Oh, Smiley started eating the potatoes real slow. The frog legs. What about the prize frog legs you won? Asked Mr. Romine. Prize? Why are they a prize? He asks. Smiley was just about to take a bite when here come old Dan'l. That's right, Dan'l Webster, the celebrated frog. His long and trusted friend come out legless. That's right. There he was with no legs, rolling himself on a miniature wooden writing board like crippled people use, pushing himself along with hand irons. Old Dan'l wheeled his way up to Smiley's table, and he looked up at Smiley with an expression so pitiful like you ain't never seen nothing like it on a critter before. Not even the most sorrowful human ever looked like that. It was a look of the betrayed, the martyred, the heartbroken, the forlorn, all at once in one face. Well, Jim Smiley could only bear one single moment of Dan'l's look. He removed his napkin, he stood up from his chair, and with everyone just a-looking, trying to figure out what was a-going on between this here fella and the crippled frog, Jim Smiley left the restaurant. And no one, not in Stockton, not in Angel's Camp, or anywheres, seen hide nor hair of old Jim Smiley ever again.
From Mark Twain Playhouse, now on VHS, The Tom and Huck Collection, starring Tom Stewart as Tom Sawyer, Johnny Furtado as Huckleberry Finn, John Basu as Jim. The Tom and Huck Collection includes, from Season 1, from Season 2, and from Season 4. From Mark Twain Playhouse, Mark Twain time travels to the future. David Daniel is Mark Twain in a Connecticut Yankee in the 20th century. Also coming to VHS from Mark Twain Playhouse. From Season 3. Start building your collection today.
Thank you for joining me this evening for two tall tales: the celebrated jumping frog of Carnivorous County and the celebrated frog legs of Carnivorous County. I hope to see you again next week. Good evening.